Shall I get started then? Good morning, everyone. My name's Karen Reicher, and I'm William Smith class of '88 and parent of a 2017 graduate. And I work in advancement with the amazing people putting on Reunion for You this weekend. I'm the Executive Director of Advancement Services. We do have a couple little tips for housekeeping. We'd ask that you keep your microphones muted to limit the background noise, and we will use the chat feature. We'll try to get to everybody's comments. If for some reason we can't, we'll definitely be back in touch with you with answers. Also, like Teresa just said, you can rename yourselves with your class year if you're interested in doing so. There's 3 dots at the top right of your square. You can click on that and rename yourself to add your class year. So I would now like to introduce our speaker this morning. Laura C. W. Blanchard received her PhD in the history of art from the University of Michigan in 2001, the same year that she began working at Hobart and William Smith colleges. She is the Luce Professor of East Asian Art and the Lloyd Wright Professor in Conservative Studies. Her articles have appeared in the journals Non-New, Men, Women, and Gender in China, Ars Orientalis, Artibus Azay, and Positions Asia Critique. Her book, Song Dynasty Figures of Longing and Desire, Gender Interiority in Chinese Painting and Poetry, received the 2020 Joseph Levinson Pre-1900 Book Prize from the Association of Asian Studies. And her co-authored textbook, Asian Art, received the 2016 Franklin R. Buchanan Prize for Asia Curriculum Materials, also from AAS. She is currently working on an article about a 19th century Chinese woman editor who compiled the first art historical text devoted to Chinese women's paintings. Welcome, Laura Blanchard.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I already said this, but some people have come into the room since I said this. So I want to say it's really nice to see so many old friends and former students, as well as a lot of people that I've never met before. What I'm going to be doing today is actually giving you a taste of what it's like to take a class in a pandemic. We were actually conducting a lot of courses via Zoom this past semester. And what I was typically doing in my classes was I would have a PowerPoint sort of like this, although this one is a little bit wordier than what I normally do in class. But basically what I would be doing is I'd be here and I would be talking about stuff on my screen and sharing it with people. So you're going to get a little bit of a feeling of what that is like. In addition to working through this PowerPoint, I'm also going to be, I think, jumping into a website and sort of sharing that with you as well. So this is possibly going to be a little bit hopefully it'll be interactive and interesting and not discombobulated and terrible. So we'll see what we can do. I'm going to actually start by starting my slideshow. And hopefully what you all are seeing is not exactly what I am seeing. I'm sort of seeing something different, but hopefully you're seeing my title slide. The title slide should say Silk, Love, Politics, and Gender in a 12th Century Chinese Painting. Closer look at court ladies preparing newly woven silk. All right, so what I wanted to do today was to introduce you to some of the stuff that I'm talking about actually in my book. And actually the book was something that originally began as my doctoral dissertation at the University of Michigan, which I started working on in 1996. So it's actually been a long time that I've been thinking about all of this material. What I was trying to do in the book was actually, and it was a revision of my dissertation. What I had done in the dissertation actually was that I had looked at lots of paintings of women from this period in Chinese history called the Song Dynasty, which begins in 960 and continues into the year 1279 approximately. Actually, that's sort of a point of debate for historians. When did the Song Dynasty really end? Which I probably don't want to get into this morning. But images of women had not really been taken seriously. And there were a number of reasons for that. Critics at the time, art critics, really did not think that images of women were actually terribly important. They would basically sort of criticize them and say, oh, these are not really serious objects of study. And I think that that meant that art historians, working now also tended to sort of overlook them, and if they did talk about them at all, they would sort of say like, well, these are images of women and they're doing the kinds of things that women do, which actually doesn't sound terribly, terribly interesting, right? And so people had basically just been overlooking all of these works of art for years. So anyway, what I did for my dissertation was I started studying these images of women, and I was trying to uncover what the deeper meanings of the paintings were. I didn't think that they were really just ordinary activities of women. And what I figured out when I was working on my doctorate was that a lot of the subjects in these paintings actually relate in various ways to love poetry. So that includes things like, let's see, things like images of women playing music. What I'm showing you here, what I hope you're seeing, is actually the first scene of the Night Revels of Han Shizai, which is a painting that probably dates to the mid to late 12th century. And this is just one scene of a rather long, horizontally oriented painting. And what it shows is actually courtesans. Some of the people in the room have actually taken a class with me called Courtesan Culture, and so they may remember this painting. But there's a courtesan here who's actually playing a musical instrument. There are other women in the room who are also holding musical instruments. And, basically that actually correlates in a really interesting way with love poetry, that these women are supposed to be like performing for people as if they were in love with them, as if they had feelings for them. And, part of being a courtesan is actually doing that kind of performance. Then I also looked at images of women looking at themselves in mirrors. So this is actually a painting from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts called A Lady at Her Dressing Table. And it actually shows a woman seated at a table looking at her own mirror reflection. She has stacks of cosmetic boxes on the table behind her. And the conceit in a poem that would be on a theme like this is that she is actually thinking about a man who's not there, probably a husband who's gone away for some reason. And she's sort of thinking about how she's aging and she's losing her beauty and, worrying that actually her husband may no longer care for her, right? And so this is actually a really popular theme in love poetry as well. Then I also looked at images like this one, and this is the one that we're going to be spending some time talking about today. This is a painting called Court Ladies Preparing Newly Woven Silk. It is attributed to an emperor named Huizong, which means that he is taking credit as the artist of this painting. In actuality, he probably isn't the artist. There's a lot of evidence that says that he had court painters making paintings for him. But we can be fairly certain that he's actually the patron of this painting. So he's actually the one who's sponsoring it and causing it to be created. Women working with cloth was one of the kinds of images that I looked at in my dissertation. And so when basically when I was doing this dissertation, I was trying to say that all of these different images relate to love poetry in some way. And this is one that does that as well. When I started thinking about revising the dissertation into a book that could be published, what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out what was going on in the minds of the people behind the paintings. So that includes the artists who are making the paintings, but also the patrons, the people who are causing the paintings to be created. Almost all of the paintings that we are looking at are thought to have been either sponsored or created by men, but that's primarily because the historical record pays a little bit more attention to the activities of men. We do know that actually women were involved in making paintings like these as well, and that women of very high status also sponsored paintings. So mostly I do think of these as being predominantly made by men and therefore predominantly representing men's ideas. But I do have to offer the caveat that women are also involved in sort of creating these images as well. Anyway, I thought that this particular painting would be a good one to look at for today. It is actually surprisingly complex, and it will probably actually be very difficult for me to do justice to this painting in the allotted time. You can't even imagine how many pages of notes I have, like at my fingertips. So I'm going to do the best that I can, but I thought that this was a good place to start. And actually, this is the first material that I published that was from the book. The material that I wrote for this particular painting, and which I'm talking to you about today, is actually included in my book, but it was also incorporated into an article that I wrote in the year 2009. And I thought that this painting was a really good place to start my inquiry into what is going on. Why are these paintings being made? Who are what are the people involved in these paintings thinking that they are conveying through them? Because this is a painting for which we have a great deal of historical documentation. The fact that it's strongly associated with an emperor and that we know so much about that emperor actually allows me to look at this and see how it fits into his political agenda. And so this was actually sort of a leaping off place for me for the book. And once I had sort of figured out what was going on with this painting, that actually provided a kind of template for me to figure out what was going on in all the other works of art that I wanted to consider in my book. All right, so this particular painting, Court Ladies Preparing Newly Woven Silk, that's actually the way that it's known in English. It also has a Chinese title, which I've shown you here as well. I don't normally give Chinese titles because normally they're not terribly relevant to the audience. In this particular case, this is actually a really important thing. The Chinese title for this painting is Dao Lian Tu, which means pounding silk. And so what that means is that the English title and the Chinese title are not really carefully connected to each other. And the Chinese title actually really gives a hint to what the meaning of this painting is. Let me see if I can actually stop sharing this and jump into a website that I have that will actually, I think, allow us to look at this a little bit more closely. All right, so I've just stopped sharing my screen. This is actually how it is in class too. It's very peripatetic. Sort of jumping back and forth between PowerPoints and websites. All right, what I've done is I've come to a website called East Asian Scroll Paintings, which is run out of the University of Chicago Center for Art of East Asia. And it's actually a really great resource. It shows all these amazing paintings, sort of at very high resolution. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to show you the same painting that I had in my PowerPoint. Now we can actually look at it in a little bit more depth. This is a horizontally oriented painting. It's read from right to left. So here at the right edge of the screen, we actually had the beginning of the painting. What you're probably seeing are, you're seeing some writing, some titles and things like that. And then we can see these images. So these are actually images of imperial concubines. So in China, in the Song Dynasty, plural marriage is practiced, and especially an emperor would have many, many different consorts. Imperial concubines are sort of like secondary wives. They're people of very, very high status in the palace, although they are of lower status than, say, the empress. These are, literally the partners of the Emperor Huizong. I should also say that I do talk about them as if these are Huizong's concubines, but in actuality, these images are not really of real people per se, in which I mean that we can't really look at these figures and say, oh, this is this particular concubine, or this is this particular concubine. Instead, this is sort of an idealized vision of Huizong's concubines. I can tell that they're concubines primarily by the way that they're dressed, and by their hairstyles and the ornaments in their hair. And so what I'm going to do, hopefully, is be able to zoom in on some of these, show you the really amazing details in this painting. But we sort of start with these images of 4 imperial concubines, sort of, with poles in their hands. And what they're doing is they're actually beating silk cloth. And this is part of the process of making clothes. And if we scroll a little bit to the left, I'm going to try to move this slowly. I don't want to give anybody motion sickness. We can actually see some more women. So there's a woman here who's sitting on a stool, and she's actually sewing, which I can primarily tell from the position of her hands. She's got a needle and thread, and she's literally pulling it through the cloth that she's holding in her other hand. So she's sewing. And then this woman is a little bit harder to figure out what she's doing, but she may be reeling thread. It's a little bit hard to understand. And then if we move a little bit further to the left, we have a young girl. I can tell that she's younger by her hairstyle. She's sort of wearing these looped braids, which is a style for, adolescents and younger. And she's actually got a painted fan that she's waving at a brazier full of coals. And what she's doing is she's actually sort of making sure that the coals don't die out. And the coals are necessary because over here, at the far left side of the painting, we have another group of women stretching out a length silk cloth, and they have some of the coals from the brazier in a copper pan. They're passing it over the cloth, and this is actually the way that they ironed cloth back in the 12th century. So the cloth must be a little bit damp. They're passing this brazier of hot coals over it, and that steams the wrinkles out, and so that's how you iron. And then some of these are concubines, right? All of the taller adult figures are concubines. This is a younger girl. Again, she's got that looped pigtail kind of hairstyle. And there's a very young girl down here sort of playing underneath the cloth. So this is actually a really amazing painting to look at. I'm actually, maybe what I'll do is rather, again, I don't want to scroll around too much because that can actually be a little bit, it can actually be a little bit difficult to deal with. I'm going to start blowing it up right here so that we can see some of the details of this painting. So I've actually blown it up pretty large at this point. So one of the things that's really impressive about this painting is just the amount of detail that we find in it. So I'm just zeroing in on this particular figure. This is a figure who's wearing very full makeup. So she has like a whitened forehead and a whitened nose. She also has a little decoration painted on her forehead. So think like a little leaf or some kind of a flower. And that was actually something that was very common in the 12th century among women of high status, to actually use their foreheads as like a painting surface, which is sort of interesting. And then she has these beautiful ornaments in her hair. Like her hair is really beautifully dressed. This is a top knot, and she's got combs sort of holding it up, and pins sort of make it more beautiful. Then she's wearing like this beautiful clothing, right? Multiple layers of patterned cloth in really vibrant colors. The details of the clothing are actually really amazing. I think that's as big as I can make this. But like even this orange cloth has like little golden roundels in it. And of course in here you can see like all of these very fine details of the painting in this section. If you come over here, I'm gonna try to move a little bit slowly to this woman, right? Again, you can sort of see the beautiful painting of the face, the beautiful layers of clothing. Right here, there are really beautiful designs in gold again on her blue skirt. So all of these kinds of things actually indicate that these are women of extraordinarily high status. And basically, almost all of the women in the painting are dressed in this really sumptuous kind of way. Even this girl here, who I think is taking the role of a servant. She's sort of doing a job that's slightly more menial. She too is like really beautifully dressed. She has ribbons around her pigtails. She has combs in her hair. She's also got the makeup. Look at the details on the skirt, right? There are these beautiful floral medallions here in pink and blue and yellow. And she has this sort of green ground, but even that has like incredible scrolling details on it. So, this is just an incredibly detailed painting. And the identity of these women is completely, obvious, that they are really meant to be members of the imperial household, both imperial concubines and possibly daughters of the concubines, which would really be daughters of the emperor. All right, so this particular painting, right, which is a longhand scroll painting, is actually a copy of an earlier composition that was created in the 8th century. And that particular painting was created by a court painter named Zhang Xuan. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get out of my website. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Basically, the information that I am including here is sort of explaining how this painting by the 8th century court painter Zhang Xuan came to be copied. So Emperor Huizong had a painting collection, and it included this painting by Zhang Xuan that was called Pounding Silk. And you may remember that that's the alternate Chinese title for court ladies preparing newly woven silk. That particular painting by Zhang Xuan, which would have been created in the 8th century, disappeared sometime after the 13th century. But it was described in a text by a writer named Yuan Haowen. And he was describing a painting from a series titled Four Scenes of Palace Women. That particular painting that he's describing sounds like it could be the basis for the painting that we're looking at today. So Yuan Haowen wrote that Zhang Xuan's original painting from the 8th century included an image of multiple women pounding silk, which is what we're seeing in this detail here. Then Yuan Haowen also says that Zhang Xuan's painting depicted a palace lady stitching clothes with her knee raised up. So just like this woman that we're seeing here. In addition, According to Yuan Haowen, Zhang Xuan's painting included a girl waving a fan at hot coals and preparing them for use in ironing. He also described servants holding a length of white silk twill that a palace lady was actually ironing. And then finally, Yuan Haowen mentions that Zhang Xuan's original painting from the 8th century included a girl playing underneath the silk by lowering her head. So all of those details apparently were there in the original 8th century painting. And then they were copied in this painting that was made in the 12th century for Emperor Huizong. Yuan Haowen's text also tells us a lot about what the 12th century court painter left out when he made the copy. So the things that got left out include images of women that were cutting and measuring cloth, as well as images of women getting dressed. In addition, the original painting from the 8th century included a really detailed setting of a garden in autumn. And that included an image of a well, a lake rock of the kind that you would find in a scholar's garden, hibiscus plants in bloom, a paulownia tree with leaves falling to indicate that it was autumn, a banana tree with yellowing leaves, and a bed. So all of that got left out the painting that we're seeing here. This particular painting that we're seeing here is actually now the best evidence that we have for what that earlier painting looked like. But it's obviously not a perfect copy. It's not a faithful copy. And that means that the 12th century painter who made this was actually making some decisions about what to include, and presumably only including the things that were really important for the purposes of Emperor Huizong in the 12th century. All right, so before I started writing about this painting, I mentioned that people tended to talk about paintings of women from this period as images that represented the ordinary activities of women. And for this particular painting, what scholars had pretty much decided was going on was that the women are participating in a ritual referred to as palace sericulture. The word sericulture refers to the processes of making silk. And normally when we see paintings of that particular topic, they look a little bit more like this. So this is a scene from a painting called Sericulture that was also, we think, made possibly in the early 12th century by an artist named Liang Kai. And this is actually showing the rural laborers who were normally responsible for creating silk. The process of sericulture is a process of multiple steps, beginning actually with raising silkworms and feeding them mulberry leaves, to the point of actually weaving the silk fiber into cloth. And normally paintings of sericulture are actually emphasizing kind of a rural setting. So in this particular painting, for example, we're actually seeing, I think we're actually looking at buildings in a village. They have thatched roofs, and you see lots of different people sort of cooperating together to sort of participate in the process of making silk. So for example, there are women in the foreground and they actually have been feeding the silkworms with mulberry leaves, and they're starting to actually separate the silkworms from the mulberry leaves. And the idea is that the silkworms are going to make cocoons of silk thread. And eventually they're going to take the silk thread from the cocoons and they're going to actually make into silk. But basically, this is a really long painting. I'm only showing you one scene, and it shows all of those different steps. So normally when we think about silk being made, we normally think about women who are sort of much lower status. Sorry, I had to look around to sort of see where my magnifying feature is. If you look at these women here, can sort of see that they're not dressed the same way as the imperial concubines in the other scroll. They're wearing clothing that's drabber in color, don't have any hair ornaments, they don't have makeup. These, look like working women. This woman is actually wearing trousers, right, with an apron sort of over it. So they're not really dressed in the same way, and that actually indicates the social class that they belong to. Right. So what does this mean for that other painting? So it is a little bit unusual for palace women to participate in the process of sericulture, but there was one point during the year when they did that, and that was usually in the springtime. It was usually a very particular ritual in which they were sort of going through the motions of making silk and then also making clothing for the emperor. And that is probably one of the more plausible explanations for the painting that we were looking at, because this particular painting here, right, Huizong's painting, right, does show these women sort of working with cloth. And presumably what they are doing is making clothing for the emperor. Um, that ritual is normally set in the springtime. If the copyist is taking all of the autumnal associations of the original painting out of that painting, then that makes it a little bit more believable as that ritual. And one thing I need to add is that the process of making silk is actually coded in China as women's work. So it's really understood to be something that is a virtuous behavior for women of all classes. There is one problem, however, with identifying what's going on in this painting as representing the rite of Palacericulture. And that is that women who are participating in that rite, which would be the empress and the imperial concubines, are not supposed to be adorning themselves in finery when they're doing this. And these women, as we've already observed, are wearing like jade in their hair. They're wearing full makeup. They are wearing like incredibly sumptuous clothing. And I think that they are actually the definition of being adorned in finery. So Palacericulture is a plausible explanation for what's going on in this painting to an extent, but there has to be something else going on here as well. So what the other thing that's going on here, this is sort of a second level of meaning, is that there are connections to love poetry. And that is where the women's adornment actually comes into play. The women have adorned themselves as if they are planning a meeting with their husband, the emperor. But in addition, there are themes in love poetry that also sort of demand that women be beautifully adorned. And the act of pounding silk is one of them. So pounding silk is actually a fairly important poetic theme. And again, that's sort of depicted here at the beginning of the painting. This painting is really only depicting 3 steps in the process of making clothing, right? So the first one is over here, pounding silk, which we already looked at. Second, we have sewing, represented by this woman. And then third, we have women ironing. Right? So these are all steps in the process of making clothing, but they're not actually all the steps. Really, what the painter is doing is choosing the most evocative steps, the ones that tend to be mentioned in love poetry. So I want to talk about this in a little bit more depth. But basically, the theme of women making clothes, and particularly pounding silk, has very, very specific poetic associations. Right, so these are themes that do appear in love poetry, and I think that the painter is specifically choosing the ones that appear in love poetry and leaving out all of the other steps. All right, so I'm going to start actually with the image of the women pounding silk. So you may remember this is again at the beginning of the painting. It's actually giving the title to the Chinese title of the painting. It's actually, I think, an extremely important poetic theme. It's really a theme that we find in love poetry from all historical periods. And what I'm showing you here, in addition to my detail of the women pounding cloth, is actually a translation of a poem that sort of explains some more about this theme. So the poem is actually written in the voice of a woman who's actually pounding silk. And she's describing what she's doing, but remember that this is a love poem, and so you actually sort of have to read between the lines here. The poem reads, "A green jade pounding cloth stone and a 7-jeweled golden lotus melon. I raise it high and slowly let it fall, softly pounding just for you." That's a 6th century poem. And there are countless others on this theme. But what this particular theme of women pounding silk has in common are the following elements. Women who are pounding silk are usually lonely. Usually they're married and their husbands have gone away somewhere. So the husband is out of the picture for some reason. And the women are desperately lonely, and they feel this most acutely in the middle of the night. And in the poetic construct, I have to emphasize, I'm not at all convinced that this is what real women would do. This is, again, the poetic imaginary, right? The poets who are writing love poetry, and these are, again, mostly men, are imagining how women missing their husbands feel. So in the poetic construct, women who are lonely and missing their husbands can't sleep, and they are moved to get up at midnight. And what they do then is they put on all their makeup, they dress their hair beautifully, they put on their most gorgeous clothing, and then they get together with other lonely women and they pick up poles, these large phallic implements, and they start beating silk in a rhythmic manner. And so this is clearly meant to be kind of a sublimated reference to sexual activity. And so basically, this is meant to sort of express longing and desire and frustration, but also love, right? And so that's really what the theme of pounding silk refers to in poetry. And I think that in this painting, this is the very first scene. This is what the title of the painting is based on. I actually think that that is meant to indicate immediately to an educated Chinese viewer that these are women in love with somebody and missing him. So that's actually, I think, a really important thing. And then there's another thing. The Chinese language is full of puns. And this is because there are, thousands and thousands of characters, and a lot of them actually have similar pronunciations. So the phrase that you use for pounding silk, lian, actually sounds exactly like a phrase that would mean pounding love. The second characters are different. The word silk is actually a homophone for the word for love. So actually, if you were thinking about this, you would think about a painting called Pounding Silk, and you would think about it being titled Pounding Love. And so that actually also clarifies that there's kind of a connection to love poetry here. And this actually carries through the rest of the painting as well, right? This image of the woman sewing, actually working with the thread. Again, this woman, you can actually visualize the thread. If you look at this very, very closely, I can actually tell you that it's sort of cutting across right here. The word for thread in Chinese is pronounced si, and that is exactly the same pronunciation as the word for longing. So si. And so basically, when you see women working with thread, you're supposed to imagine them like longing for somebody who's not there. Again, this is a very particular kind of theme in love poetry. And then even the ironing is significant. This is not a very common poetic theme, but I did find this one poem that alludes to what the idea of coals could actually refer to. So I actually have two lines here. She must see the old dying coals within the gold censer. She won't willingly let her fond feelings become like those cold ashes. So coals that you use in ironing are actually a metaphor for smoldering passion. And so really, when we're looking at this painting, we're thinking about women pounding silk. We're thinking about women working with thread. We're thinking about women ironing. But those are all references to women longing for an absent man. And that, I think, is actually the second level of meaning of this painting. Palace sericulture is one of the meanings, but the second meaning is that all of these women are rapturously in love with their husband, the emperor. So I think that is actually a really important thing to sort of take note of. And then there are other things going on in this painting as well. So again, returning to the images of the women pounding cloth, these are actually the third and fourth figures in the scroll. This one here is actually very clearly pulling her sleeve up in order to expose her wrist. And this is an exact kind of situation that's alluded to in poetry as well. So this is actually two lines from an 8th or 9th century poem called Song of Pounding Cloth. Women and girls face each other and begin to work. As they bare their white wrists, the mallets sing. The mallets were also used for pounding cloth in addition to poles. The idea of the woman baring her wrist is actually meant to be very suggestive. I think in the 21st century, it doesn't really read in the same way, especially not in Western culture. But in the context of 12th century China, the idea that a woman would be like deliberately pulling her sleeve up and revealing a normally covered part of her body was actually meant to be a highly suggestive kind of action. And then the other thing that we can do with this woman is if we look at her really closely, right? This is a beautifully adorned lady. She has just taken a break from beating silk with a pole in order to pull up her sleeve and expose her wrist. And as she does that, she seems to be looking directly at the viewer
and meeting his gaze. So it's almost like she's looking directly at somebody as she does this. And the somebody that she's looking at is the painting's viewer. And the painting's viewer, the primal viewer, is the patron, Emperor Huizong. So where does that leave us? I guess it leaves us with a number of things to think about. But one of the things I do want to mention here is the paintings that are normally coming out of Emperor Huizong's court look more like this. This is a painting called Cranes of Good Omen. It records an event of 1112. And actually, this is a painting that has a very clear political agenda. It's meant to record an auspicious event. And basically, it's meant to attest to the idea that there are miracles happening at his court. And that is meant to indicate that he possesses something called the mandate of heaven, and therefore he is fit to rule. This painting, I think, can be understood in the same way. So making clothes for the emperor, the rite of palace sericulture, is a form of women's work, and it can be understood as a display of virtue. But women are also doing suggestive actions. They have artificially heightened their beauty in ways that are not consistent with palace sericulture. And that's meant to indicate their love for and their loyalty to their husband, who would be the emperor. And finally, the emperor is able to command the loyalty of virtuous people. He must be fit to rule. The concubines in this particular painting are an allegory for the emperor's loyal advisors. So the idea of devoted imperial concubines is meant to refer to the loyalty of the emperor's advisors. And that is a political interpretation, which indicates that this is a painting that is not really about the ordinary activities of women. It's actually a painting that fits into the political agenda of the patron. All right, so I can see that we're actually extremely short on time. So I'm actually just going to stop here. I'm happy to stay on for as long as people are available, and I'm very happy to answer questions. What I may do actually is stop sharing so that I can actually see people.
You can certainly unmute yourself and ask questions right direct, or if you're more comfortable in the chat, anybody can type in there. I see a hand up.
Sally, would you like to go ahead?
3 questions, a couple of them quick, I think. How large was this painting?
Oh, that is a great question. And I normally actually put dimensions on my image sheets, and I didn't think to do that today. So let me see, how long is this painting? It's actually surprisingly small. So I'm going to say the painting is probably, oh, I can't actually do this on Zoom, I don't think. I'm going to say the painting is probably about 15 inches high. And I should really look this up. I feel like it's maybe about 6 feet long, maybe a little bit longer. It's not very big.
And it looks as if in all that fairly small space, people have used a stamp on some of the clothing. It was relief printing, something that was available in those days as a technology?
Relief printing is definitely something that is possible in those days. And in fact, we do see that in a lot of the collector's seals on the painting, but all of the details on the clothing are actually painted by hand. So they're painted using a brush and pigments. They were not, the details of the painting itself was actually all done with painting, not through a printing process.
How do you know that?
How do I know that? Because actually the designs are not perfectly similar. There are slight variations among all of them. If you look at them very, very closely, you can sort of see that it's not a simple reproductive process. There are actually very tiny variations, and that does indicate that they are actually painting by hand.
Of course. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions?
Melissa, I can see you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you for this really awesome talk, and congratulations on the book again. I'm so excited to read it. It's going to be great. I have a comment and a question. So first, I found your talk was very illuminating into these parts of sericulture that have connotations of attraction, of love, and of this, you said, the sublimation or sublimated reference to women's love and sexual frustration. which, you know, thinking to Mao Dun's 1930 short story, maybe 1933 short story of spring silkworms.
Oh,
I think what you've said here could probably illuminate some interesting features of that story, which also features a kind of a story of sericulture wrapped in a Marxist perspective. It's looking at sericulture as labor as opposed to this, yeah, more so as labor. But the parts that that story focuses on are these not sexy parts of sericulture. It is the hatching of the worms, and
yes.
there is a sort of sensuality that he pairs with that, because like the eggs are very delicate. They're going to die. The woman has to put them in her clothing so that her body can keep them warm and protect them. And so I just think it'd be very cool to analyze that story in light of what you've brought to light on this painting. But that's my first comment. That's my comment.
Oh, that's a great comment.
My question is about is a bit of a comparison, actually. So you mentioned that I was wondering if you've looked at any paintings that are inspired by the poetry of Li Qingzhao.
Oh,
And and in a way, well, I don't know if Li Qingzhao does anything with sericulture, but is there anything that we can do comparing like her poetry and maybe paintings inspired by her that are going to help us get a better perspective of the male gaze or the male imagination of this painting that you showed us today?
That is really such a great question. So Li Qingzhao, for those of you who may not be familiar, is probably China's preeminent woman poet, and she actually lives in exactly the same time period that we're talking about, the late Northern Song dynasty, and sort of moving into the violent transition to the Southern Song. So this is she's sort of a late 11th century to mid 12th century poet, and she's a great poet, right? I don't know, Melissa, if you're familiar with Ronald Egan's recent book on Li Qingzhao, but that was a major inspiration for things that I was doing in my book. So I was really drawing very heavily on his analysis of what Li Qingzhao was really writing about. And I was really trying to use knowledge of her poetry to sort of give insight into what women might have contributed to these images of, you know, women in love, right? Because basically my book is primarily focusing on these sorts of romantic images. And I was sort of interested in like, you know, how much of these images are actually created by male poets and male painters, and how involved were women in sort of shaping this particular kind of perception. So a lot of times what Li Qingzhao is doing is she, you know, she's a real master poet, and she's actually able very easily to sort of slip into the kind of male perspective and write from that point of view. But she does also write poems that are very different in their viewpoint. And I think it is actually very, very interesting to think about how a woman artist or a woman poet might actually handle these themes, you know, maybe in a slightly different way. And I think that is actually that's actually something I try to do in the book. Part of my book is trying to imagine, you know, what are women painters doing with this material, and what would this image of like these images of missing men, you know, what would that mean for a woman? And I think, you know, for a woman, it's about like a display of idealized femininity, right? This is what men want to see. And, you know, if you want to be perceived as lovable and feminine, this is the kind of persona that you need to adopt. So I do think that like virtue, but devotion also, I think both of those are key things in the picture of femininity that was important at this particular time.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Melissa. It's great to see you again. So I'll just really quickly say that, you know, again, it's been really great talking to all of you this morning. Thank you for being so patient with me during my technological glitch. You know, I have to say HWS students, like throughout the pandemic, have been so great about being patient about like, my PowerPoint's not working. I can't get this website to load. You know, it's been kind of educational for everybody in surprising ways. So. Okay, I'm going to look quickly at the chat and see if there are any other questions.
I think you're all set in the chat. Yeah, we were watching the chat for you. And thank you too for all of this with the technical part as well. The interesting part about doing this in this virtual setting is we as advancement staff are moving from one program to the other as well. So that's why I sadly had to say, we're at the 11:40 mark.
I actually noticed it on my own because I wasn't,
Yeah.
I was like all in my head and was not really, yeah, I did notice. But yes.
Laura, do you want to also post your email in the chat? If
Yeah,
anybody has any other questions. And also, I think I have the scroll, the website where you had the scroll from, if you'd like me to post that as well.
that would be great. Yeah. So that's actually a really fun website to play with. And they have 96 paintings on it. So like if you're actually interested in East Asian art generally, that's really a fun website to explore. So my email is just blanchard@hws.edu. You know, my surname and then the, you know, the normal HWS email apparatus. Right. Thank you so much, Teresa, for posting that link.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that, oh, go ahead, Carol.
So for those of us who studied Italian Renaissance art when we were in college with Elena and not Sericulture, can you recommend us an article we can read so we can get more background on what you've been talking about?
Oh, that is a great question. So I would actually recommend my own article, which
Get out
is,
after the, or maybe you can post it with the.
I can. I'm posting it in the chat right now. I'm posting the abbreviated title. This is actually, I think actually if you search for this, it's Laura Blanchard, and then the short title is Huizong's New Clothes. That is actually freely available on the Ars Orientalis website. So, you know, I think if you actually Google either one of those, either Ars Orientalis or Huizong's New Clothes, you would find it that way. And I can tell you it is in volume 36. So it was in 2009. So that would be basically everything I just said, slightly more complex, maybe with more detail.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very good. All right. Anything else before we say goodbye to Laura? Well, good. Well, thank you so much for joining us for our virtual reunion weekend. We really tried to put some mix of programs together. It's been such an honor working with Laura as well, and what I've learned. And I just appreciate everybody being here and having, like you said before, having patience with this space.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. And I just want to quickly give a shout out to Chris Slavey, who is my research assistant on this project, one of 3. It's really nice to see him here. So.
Very good. And just a reminder too, all of these programs will be recorded. So if there are things that you can't get in and out of for the weekend, once everything is completed for the weekend, we'll have all of these videos up on our YouTube channel. But Laura, thank you so much. I so appreciate everything that you've put into this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's so great to see all these different people. I look forward actually to catching up with all of you, maybe not in this space, but maybe sometime soon.